I'd like to thank all of you for coming this evening. It's really a nice and fitting tribute to the memory of Bob and Linda to get a program like this organized. I had the pleasure of sitting in on one of the workshops for students, and it was really very impressive in the spirit of mentorship and really giving the students at the Oriental Institute and the Anthropology Department this kind of exposure. So I'm really grateful to Naomi for coming and for sharing her expertise with us with so much grace and enthusiasm, and the word I kept hearing was accessibility, which is a real compliment. Naomi Miller is certainly someone who mentored me when I was in graduate school. When I was complaining about how long my dissertation was taking, she told me, however long you think it's going to take, just double it. Fortunately, she was right. Anyway, Naomi has a tremendous amount of expertise and knowledge in the fields of anthropology and archaeobotany. She received her BA, her MA, and her PhD from the University of Michigan in anthropology. She has extremely extensive fieldwork experience and experience working with the archaeobotanical remains from a variety of different sites. She's worked, her dissertation work was done at the very important urban site of Malayan in the highlands of Iran, working with Bill Sumner back when he was at Ohio State, before he came to the University of Chicago. Naomi has also worked in Turkmenistan at the site of Anal. She's worked with remains from the excavations at Tel Es-Swayhat, working with Richard Zettler. She's worked with material remains from Israel, from Turkey at sites like Gritale, Kurban Huyuk, Oriental Institute excavation, Haji Nebi, Kazane Huyuk, and of course most recently Gordion. She's also written very extensively, and she's known in the world of anthropology as the Dung Lady, and it's meant in the nicest possible way because of her. It may sound silly, but she has made major methodological contributions in showing that archaeobotanical remains are showing us not what people ate, but what animals ate when they got as fuel. So she's made very significant methodological contributions to how we can use archaeobotany and get beyond sampling problems to understand economic and environmental questions. She's edited a number of very important volumes, including the wonderful fest strip for Bill Sumner called Yeki Brut, Yeki Na Brut. Once Upon a Time. She's co-editor of the Archaeology of Garden in the Field with Catherine Gleason, and Economy and Settlement of the Ancient Near East, a publication of MASCA. She's a senior research specialist at the Museum of Applied Science Center for Archaeology. And her talk tonight is Past, Present, and Future of the Landscape in the Realm of King Midas, Gordion, Turkey. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Naomi.
Okay, well, thanks for that nice introduction, and thanks. I'm really honored is not strong enough a word to express how I feel about being here. It really is, it's an honor to be giving a talk at the Oriental Institute. It is particularly an honor to be giving the inaugural Braidwood Lecture, because even though, like, I think I met your parents once when I was here on a visit, but even though I am a product of Michigan, the University of Michigan, which was at the time kind of Oriental Institute East, so many of my mentors had studied at the University of Chicago, For archaeobotanists, especially archaeobotanists working in the Old World, but I think archaeobotanists the world over, the Braidwood's project, which was studying the origins of agriculture, I mean, their intellectual project, with the understanding that you need, if you want to understand agriculture, you really need to know something about plant remains. And it might not be a bad idea to systematically look for them instead of just depending on the random plant remains that you occasionally find in large, in collections on archaeological sites. I think you could make a pretty good argument that that work in the late 40s and early 50s really was the establishment for modern archaeobotany. The idea that you systematically look for plant remains, you don't rely on what randomly shows up on your dig. And all archaeobotanists and therefore all archaeologists should be, if they're not, be grateful for that particular contribution that the Braidwoods made. So I guess I'll start. You saw the title slide. This slide, I will be talking about the site of Gordion, which is in central Turkey. It's known as the home of King Midas. It's also known as the place where Alexander cut the Gordian knot. If you go there today just as a tourist, it's about like 90 kilometers from Ankara, what you see are some standing archaeological monuments. So this is the settlement mound. It's called the Citadel Mound, which is where people would have lived. And scattered around the landscape, there's the biggest one. That's a artificial hill. That's called Tumulus MM. It used to be called the Midas Mound until recent redating made us realize it wasn't King Midas in there. And then there are many, over 100 smaller burial mounds called tumuli that dot the landscape. And it really is a magical landscape. But if you think archaeologically, what were people doing? Well, people lived here, and after they died, they didn't die here, but after they died, some of the rulers were buried there. But a lot of the activity and people's lives, in fact, did not take place here or there, but it took place in the land in between, because these people were farmers and people lived on the landscape, and they were surrounded by landscape. So one of the things that archaeobotany can do, we excavate and get plant remains from archaeological sites, but we then interpret them in terms of the broader picture of what was growing in an area. So this is just, again, it's very hard to express. For those of us who work there, we love that place because it is an amazing landscape, and it's hard to photograph it. But here again, you see, there is a kind of magic to having all of those ancient burial mounds nearby. So just to situate you, there's Gordion within Turkey, and then there's the Sakarya River, which flows north, the Porsuk River. Gordion, this city of Gordion, was near the confluence of the Sakarya and Porsuk River, and which is significant because it was an important trade route. And in fact, there's a little piece of the mound that, or not the mound, there's a little piece of the Roman road that followed the earlier roads. The royal road to Susa goes through Gordion. Now, the organization of my presentation tonight, I decided to color code it so that in order to understand the past, you have to kind of understand the present, because the past no longer exists. The way we get at the past is through the present. So I'll be talking about the landscape today, and the background is going to be in green, because that's today and it's about plants. When I switch over to talking about the archaeological results, the background's going to be blue. And then when I start talking about the future, it won't be rose, it's going to be black. And that's because photographs show up a lot better against a black background than against a red background. So it's a purely practical, it's not an editorial comment, it's just a practical matter. What's next? Okay, so again, one of the things, obviously climate has a strong influence on vegetation, and one of the things that you can see from this rainfall map, obviously the wetter is the blue and the purple, and the drier is the yellow. In central Anatolia, Gordion's right around there. As you go up in elevation, it gets wetter. But if you're just in one place, if you're Palatla is our nearest weather station. It's about 20 miles away. It's a little wetter there than it is right at the site. But one of the things that you can see is there's really quite amount of variation in rainfall from one year to the next. And just for those of you who happen not to be farmers, the rule of thumb in the Near East is for rainfall agriculture to occur regularly, you need a minimum of about 250 millimeters on average of rainfall. So clearly, at Gordion, it's not a desert. It's arid, but it's not that dry. But people do have to deal with the variation in rainfall from one year to the next, and this is to give you some idea. This is the Citadel Mound, a picture taken from about the same place. And also everybody can hear me if I'm not at that mic? Oh, okay. Anyway, you can see that it does vary the vegetation varies from one year to the next. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is show you some of the modern vegetation, because remember, there may or may not have been plants growing where people were living. Maybe they had some potted plants, on their terraces. But basically, the plant remains that you find on the archaeological site were brought in from the environment. They were brought in from the outside. And so I'm going to show you some of the natural vegetation that still exists to this day, some of the forest vegetation, and the pine forest, some juniper, where juniper grows, and sort of where oak grows as well. And right near Gordion, the steppe vegetation. Okay, so there you see vegetation climb. As the moisture changes, so does the vegetation. In this case, we'll go in the opposite direction. Closest to the site, about 45-minute walk away, is this attractive grassy steppe vegetation that you don't really see much. This is a protected area, or was a protected area, surrounded by fields, so the animals didn't graze there. And it may not look like much to you, but the vegetation of central Anatolia, it's not the rainforest, but for an arid area, is extremely diverse because Turkey is on the crossroads of continents and it has vegetation influence from all over. As you go a little bit further away from the site and a little bit higher up, you start getting a mix of juniper and oak, but it's kind of scrubby and short. When you get a little further away and it's a little wetter, you start getting real trees. And this may look pretty barren to you, but if you're a botanist, one of the things, when you see big trees like this, like that one and that one, what it shows you is that the reason the climate is not the issue here. Obviously, it's wet enough that big trees can grow. So if the trees are spaced so far apart, it just means that people cut them down. So you're seeing human influence on the landscape today. And then this is the pine forest. They do have controlled logging in the pine forest, but that's when you get even further away. And there's an understory of oak and juniper. So that's the modern vegetation. And when we look later at the charcoal that you get from the site, you'll be remembering that, I hope. Okay, now, in addition to the relatively natural vegetation that's available, there's a lot of evidence for human impact on the landscape. Now, when you're as an archaeologist, people mostly think about the built environment. And by the built environment, we think of things like the village. And you'll notice, this is not a snowflake, that's just to remind me to mention this. That's the Tumulus MM, that's the big tumulus. And you can also see there in the distance on the ridge, there's one, and behind the water tower is another, are some of these burial mounds. So there's definitely, this is not a pristine landscape by any stretch of the imagination. Much of human impact on the environment is almost by definition bad. Deforestation, by cutting down the trees, you increase the likelihood of erosion. And here you see, and once you have massive erosion, once you lose the soil, you're never going to get reforestation because the trees need dirt to grow. So deforestation, this is relatively permanent. Like you're never going to get forest here in non-geological time. Overgrazing, obviously, by definition, is bad because it's overgrazing. And how do we know it's overgrazed? Because we see the little trails that are left by the sheep, the goats, and the cows who are trying to save energy by always walking at the same level. And then agriculture can have either good influence or bad influence. I mean, it depends on how sustainable it is. And in this area, a mixture of pastoralism or pastoral production with animals like sheep and goat and cattle combined with rainfall agriculture is the traditional mode of production, and you also can get some irrigation. So, Right, so we are now moving to the archaeology. So there will not be a test at the end, but, and we're just going to do the numbers. So Mary Voigt was the excavation director for this project, and she developed the Yasuyuk's the name of the, Yasuyuk means flat mound, and that's the name of that Citadel Mound because it's a big flat mound. And so the Yasuyuk stratigraphic sequence, YHSS, goes from the top down, because we dig from the top down, and the higher numbers are the older deposits. And for the talk tonight, we didn't have any Roman remains. There was where we were digging, there is Roman material on the site, but not exactly where we dug. And the so-called time of King Midas is this Middle Phrygian period, and thanks to recent redating, we now know, we define it at the beginning of the Middle Phrygian period is based on an arbitrary event. It's not, and the arbitrary event was a major fire. And for a long time, it was originally thought to be, this was destruction, that the invaders had come and torched the place. And the thing is, there are no dead bodies, which you would expect. There are sites like at Hassanlu in Iran where the place was torched and there are a lot of dead bodies, and the archaeologists say it's really depressing to excavate there because they find all these bodies that were caught in the fire. In this case, think of Mrs. O'Leary's cow, this being Philadelphia, seems like Chicago, sorry. Yeah, cut that off of the the recording. Anyway, it being Chicago, you guys can understand. Imagine, I'm thinking like Philadelphia row houses. You have a series of houses, and the roofs are all connected. And even though it's a mud brick house, there's a lot of vegetation in the roof, and the fire just spread like wildfire. Well, anyway, so that's one of the things that you can see here is that's a pretty straight line. Rarely in archaeology, and those archaeologists in your audience, correct me if I'm wrong, rarely do you have this nice, flat, level change in strata. And what happened was, there was this big fire. After the fire was over, during the fire, the roof caved in, and then they decided they would just level it all flat. So these walls were leveled in antiquity to that height. And then they put a couple of meters, so like 6 to 8 feet, of clean clay over a large area, the size of a football field at least, if not more. Clean clay they put over this, and then they built right on top of it. And it's the same property. They learned their lesson. Instead of having a row house with attached housing, they have separate buildings, but it follows the same property lines. So this is the early Phrygian, and that's the late Phrygian, and it's the same, like it really is, there's continuity of settlement, but there is this sharp stratigraphic break. Okay, so again, this is just a little refresher just to remind you what the forest looks like, but I don't have to go into any great detail, right? Right. Okay. So now we're going to get to the archaeological results. I'm just sort of moving right along here. One of the things, it's not that hard to identify charcoal if you have a microscope. And fortunately, the particular kinds of woods that were found at Gordion are relatively easy to tell apart, which made the analysis relatively simple. What you do is you just, for any given time period, you look at the charcoal, you identify it, and then you look at the changes in proportions over time. And I think it's fairly easy to see that there is, over time, between the late Bronze Age and the medieval period, it tends to be, generally speaking, a decline in juniper. You also see, you can make an argument, maybe an increase in oak, sort of. The category other are things like tamarisk and willow and hawthorn, and they're plants either that grow along the river so that water is not an issue for them, or they're plants of the secondary. Once you cut down the main forest, you get the secondary forest trees coming in. So one of the things which is really noteworthy about this particular assembly, and then the pine, so this peak here could be small sample size, which I didn't bother to tell you about, but trust me, it could just be random, or maybe it's significant. I'm not sure about the pine, but after period 6, the early Phrygian, does seem to be some increase for whatever that's worth. One of the things that these graphs tell me is that the major forest woods, which were pine, juniper, and oak, are always an important part of the assemblage. And that these other woods, these secondary woods, are never greater than 20%. And what that tells me is that the massive deforestation that you see today, with almost no trees at all close to the site, is relatively recent. And it was interesting when I was talking to the geomorphologist who did not know that I had done this work. And he had done some coring in the center of the valley, and he comes back and he says, I think the erosion happened pretty quickly. And since he being a geologist, I said, well, what do you mean by quickly? Because they have a sort of different time. And he said, I don't know. And remember, this was just in the field. I said, I don't know, maybe a couple hundred years. And I said, well, gee, could it be maybe 1,000 years, or it could be maybe late antiquity? And he said, yeah, and how do you know? He says, well, you look at the grain size, and it's big, the grains are big, and they just look like, this erosion would happen really quickly. So that's interesting, because according to my analysis, I don't have, during the whole sequence through the medieval period, I don't have evidence for massive erosion. So we independently, we had reached that same conclusion, so that was very gratifying. Now, the thing about juniper is, when you cut it down, it's very slow growing. And so I once looked at some juniper charcoal through the microscope, and it was a piece that was about a quarter the size of my thumb. And there were 15 annual rings that I counted. So that's a slow-growing tree. And it also, unless you're making, gin from the juniper berries, in terms of human food, it's really not that important to plant. And it also, the same geomorphologist, when we were out looking at, he was looking at rocks and I was looking at plants, and we were driving around, and I noticed, gee, in this part of in this area, it looks like there's all this oak, and in that area, it looks like there's all this juniper. And he was thinking, gee, in this area, there's all this basalt-based rock soil, and in this area, there's all this gypsum-based soil. And the gypsum soils which have a lot of juniper on them, are relatively close to the site. So I think what we're seeing here is the juniper grew close to the site on the gypsum soils, and you cut it down, it doesn't grow back, and it just gradually declined. Then the oak does grow back when you cut it down. It grows back and it grows much more quickly, and juniper and oak grow together, but if you cut both of them equally, juniper will eventually replace oak. And so that's what this tells me. And again, with the pine, it's not 100. Oak replaces juniper, sorry. So that's the charcoal. Okay. So now we're moving right along here. A lot of times people want to know, well, what did they eat? Well, we do have evidence for crops, many of which were undoubtedly eaten, some of which may not have been eaten. But the main crop plants that we find, so we have barley, bread wheat, einkorn, which is a genetically primitive kind of a wheat, lentil, bitter vetch, which people may well have eaten, or it could have been fodder for the animals. We found 6 chickpeas, a very small amount of flax, which again, it could be the flax that we found in a jar. It could be that it was seeds for growing for fiber, or maybe they were using the flax to eat. It's hard to tell from the context. I found a couple of cherry pits, some 6 little fragments of wild almond shell. Some hazelnut was found in the royal precinct. Then the last 3, rice, millet, and cotton, are interesting. The rice was only found in a little bit of rice in the medieval context. The cotton also was found only in the medieval context. The millet there was a little bit found elsewhere, but it was mostly found in the medieval context. And those 3 crops, they're summer irrigated crops. So that's what makes them different from the other plants, which may not even need irrigation or are planted in the fall. So those 3 crops are a little bit different, and they represent a different kind of agricultural regime. But a lot of times, as was alluded to, they don't call me the dung lady for nothing. A lot of times you don't find just food plants in these deposits. Most of the time you don't find burnt buildings, so you don't have stores, massive stores of food remains. Like the hazelnut, for example, was only found not in trash, it was found because there were burnt buildings. It was found in, so it was found in burnt buildings. Mostly you just find miscellaneous seeds from ancient trash deposits. And of the 30,000, for that whole sequence of the 30,000 wild seeds that I identified, most of them actually came from a plant that was somewhat like clover, which is called trigonella, and that's that. And the thing is, by the time the Bronze and Iron Age, yes, indeed, wild plants are edible, but people tend not to, and if they eat wild plants, they tend to be, as we all know, like mesclun or like baby greens, right? It's quite a luxury. Well, you're never going to find baby greens in an archaeological deposit. And by the time the plant is old enough to go to seed, it's basically animal fodder. You wouldn't want to eat it. And these people were farmers. They weren't out there in the fields collecting wild seeds to eat. So the wild seeds that you find a lot of probably come from animal fodder that was burned as fuel. Reasonable people can disagree on this, but that's my opinion. Okay, so if in these my discussion of the seeds, I'm not talking about seeds from the burnt buildings. I'm only talking about seeds from trash remains. So these are not food remains. There's probably animal fodder remains. So if you can reasonably accept that most of the seeds are from animal dung burned as fuel, then that's interesting, because then the wild to cereal ratio is kind of a way to measure or to monitor the animals going out to graze versus people growing fodder for the animals, or for animals grazing on field stubble from food crops. And if you look over time, this particular ratio is based on the number of wild seeds versus the weight of the cereals. And I would like to point out the time of King Midas, which is a time of great wealth on this site. That's the lowest point of the wild to cereal ratio. So in other words, it has to do with the animals were going out to graze less, that people were actually doing the labor to grow fodder for the animals during that time of King Midas. All right, well, what about the animals? Well, Melinda Zeter and Susie Arter did the faunal analysis for the site, and there are the major food animals that represent the bulk of the animal bone were sheep, goat, cattle, and pig. And sheep and goat are hard to tell apart, and although you can in some cases, and a lot of times we just lump together sheep and goat as animals. They're similar, although not identical in their needs, and for purposes of the analysis, the sheep and goat are more like each other than either are like cattle or pig. Now, cattle and pig both they need surface water, and therefore in an arid environment that has a river running through it, they're going to tend to stay closer to home, and they're less likely to be sent long distances to graze. And one of the things that you could notice here is that the greatest amount of the animals that stay close to home, the cattle and the pig, is in this Middle Phrygian period when the site seems to have been the wealthiest. And what also seems to happen is there's a kind of a normal, about 80% sheep and goat, and then sheep and goat decline, and then at the end of the Middle Phrygian period, they gradually work their way up, and so then it seems like this area normal is about 80% sheep-goat bone to cattle and pig bone. Okay, so what happened? Yes?
When did the pig show up in the Middle East?
Domesticated pigs?
Yes, ma'am.
Like 8,000 BC? He's the expert. 7,000 BC. So, pardon? No, but in this we're talking. These are domestic. The analysis was domestic. They were domesticated. These animals were domesticated that we're talking about.
Where did they come from?
There were wild pigs.
There are wild pigs also. Oh, that was the question? Yeah, but the ones at issue here they exist, but they're mostly domesticated on the ancient site. Anyway, so if you recall my argument that the wild to cereal ratio is telling you whether animals are going out to graze or if they're being fed fodder or grazing on stubble, and then you compare that graph, goes up and then down, and then it goes up again, and then you look at the percent of sheep goat, it goes up and then down, and then it goes up again. So that's, for me, that's pretty close parallel, and it supports my contention that you can have an association when you're sending animals out to graze. You're more likely, you're more likely to be sending sheep and goat out to graze than cattle, and certainly not pig. Okay, so now what about other evidences for agriculture? So I decided to look at the plants of streamsides and ditches as a kind of as a proxy for maybe for irrigation, to see what was going on there. And what it looks like is that if, okay, this is just for as your control group. You see that here I'm arguing that in this period agriculture was the most important than it ever was at any other time in the sequence. And at that very same time, look, there's this localized peak in what I'm arguing are the indicators for irrigation. So that's pretty interesting. And then if you look at the medieval period, that also has high evidence for irrigation. And that's kind of interesting too, because on the one hand we have high evidence for the pastoralism in the sheep and goat, but we also have evidence for intensive agriculture. And what this tells me, and if you may recall, we have summer irrigated crops, the rice, the millet, and the cotton, that become important in the medieval period. And if you think about it, if you have an economy that's based basically on rainfall agriculture with a little bit of irrigation, but you're basically planting in the fall and harvesting in the spring, and the summer is your dead season. You don't have, you can go on vacation in the summer. You don't have to worry about what's going on in the summer. Well, you introduce these summer irrigated crops. Is that progress? Or did the peasants have to work harder? Because now they have to work year round. You be the judge. Anyway, so that was kind of interesting. And let's see. Which brings us to the takeaway message about sustainability in this area. And that is, if you look at the archaeological record that covers a couple of thousand years, what it really looks like is that in the long run, the most sustainable agricultural use of the landscape, now you might have other uses, but the agricultural use of the landscape integrates the winter cropping of dry farm cereals and summer irrigation of garden crops, and you have some pastoral production based on sheep and goat herding. So usually archaeology is not particularly relevant to the modern world, but it is in this case because there's a lot more irrigation than there used to be, and in the next part of this talk, when I'll talk about the future, you'll see what the effect of that massive irrigation has on the landscape. And hence the question, what about tomorrow? We had yesterday and today. Okay, so this brings me to a project that is near and dear to my heart. Welcome to Midas World. This Midas World, the theme park. And this is based on a Phrygian door design and architecture. And we have, in case you're interested, that's Kibble with her lions. And those are graffiti or little scratch graffiti that were found on the site. Okay, you may recall this picture from before when in 1992, an archaeologist he was at Penn, a classical archaeologist, Keith DeVries, he liked to walk a lot, and he had been working on the site from the Rodney Young days, and he had in walking around, he had found this little patch of grassy, relatively intact steppe vegetation. You saw those other photographs, and the animals, there's not a blade of grass hardly to be seen near the village because the animals pretty much eat it all up, or else there's agricultural farming. And the reason this patch is about a 45-minute walk from the village, and it's between two villages. It's on a slope. There was fields around it at the bottom. There was a field at the top. There was no irrigation, and nobody ever went up here. And I was with our ethnoarchaeologist, and I was wondering, like, we ran into the owner of this land. And so she asked him, how come you don't graze the animals here, and how come you don't farm here? And he was wealthy enough, so he didn't have to farm every bit of land he owned. And he said, well, he just, grazing land in Turkey is communally owned. So why would he graze his own animals on his own land if he could graze his own animals on communal land? And he said, I don't really, I just thought the plants were interesting here. So he had been kind of protecting it just because he was rich enough to be able to afford to protect it. Well, but nothing lasts forever. And one of the, when I went up there, I would go up there sort of every year to visit it, and it was such a pretty place. And I thought, gee, it would be really nice if we could get this kind of vegetation growing near the site where tourists would see it, because the ordinary tourist isn't going to walk 45 minutes over fields and field roads to get to this nice vegetation. And the opportunity came in the mid-90s, about, I guess, 1995. We're sitting around on the balcony, like the sun is setting, and there were some visitors from the MASCA-Museum, I think, and everybody's worried about erosion. It was a big thing, like erosion this, erosion that. In Turkey, it's a big problem. And the Turks were saying that that because we had excavated in the Tumulus MM, that was causing erosion, because we had done the excavation there, that was causing erosion on this important archaeological monument. And wasn't that terrible? And shouldn't we stop the erosion? So I said, and I wonder, and how do you do that? And I said, well, why don't you get plants to grow on it? And they said, well, how do you do that? And I said, well, I don't know, like put a fence around it. And they did. And you can see here the effect of the fence that was erected in 1990, the winter of like 95, 96. And here, actually, you can see there was excavation. That's a little bit of the Roman road that goes across Anatolia. Well, in this next part of the talk, which concerns the future, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work I've been doing on the Tumulus MM. Then I'll talk a little bit about the work using plants to help archaeological preservation on the Citadel Mound, which is the where people were living. And then I'll show you our demonstration gardens that we're developing. Okay, this is the kind of thing that the Turkish authorities were worried about. There are these big erosion channels. So this erosion channel 5. Here you could see the scale of close up. Here's a person, and so this is 53 meter high burial mound, and that was what the fence was put up to protect that mound. And the fence was put up in the winter 95, 96. And by 97, it had already started the vegetation. There was enough seed source, plants had already started to grow back. And then by 2001, you could see a real difference between the inside and the outside of the mound. And it has to do with grazing. Like this mound it's right near, it's in the village, and it's on the main route to watering the animals. So there was always a lot of animal traffic nearby. So the fence was pretty good in terms of letting plants grow. But because we were concerned about the erosion channels, I was fortunate to get Kurt Blumel. He's a perennial grass nurseryman. That's his specialty, is perennial grasses. And he's well known in perennial grass circles. And he was willing to come to the site and give us some advice about how to not just let the plants passively, grow back on the mound, but to see if we could do anything. And we were walking around, and I had been thinking, well, gee, maybe you could have cement like sluices, or you could line these erosion channels with stone, and would that work? And he said, no, because water finds its own level. If you put anything hard on the mound, the water will undercut when the winter rains come, and it wouldn't work anymore. And then I said, well, gee, a local building is with mud brick. What would happen if we put mud brick on the mound? And he said, well, that might be worth a try, because the mud brick would melt in place instead of getting pushed down the mound, and the water wouldn't run around it. The water would run through it, literally. And so we just had a little experiment on it. When we set up this mud brick, we didn't put a lot of seeds, but we could put some annual seeds in. And it didn't take long. and it would turn out to work. It was a great technology that in the space of a year or two, you could already see that that was the end of that erosion channel. It's like, and now, you know, it's completely filled in with plants. So we were very happy with that success, or with you know, because it was a great success. So a lot of people say, well, why don't you plant things? Well, some people say, why don't you just plant kudzu? Well, there are issues. Like, you don't want to bring in non-native plants. And it's not just a question of the practicality of what would grow there at all, but there's a philosophy, too, that you don't want to introduce foreign things, and foreign plants. And the other thing is that the native plants, if it's a good year, the plants that need a lot of rain will do well. If it's a bad year, the plants that don't need a lot of rain will do well. There's always going to, if you use the native vegetation, there's always going to be something growing. And so instead, you don't want to have a monocrop. But we were thinking, since the native vegetation is perennial grasses, maybe we should grow perennial grasses. And it turns out that perennial grasses are very hard to grow from seed, as we discovered, because everything green here is a weed that's growing up between these planting. So not a single grass seed grew. So that was the end of why don't we plant perennial grasses? But nature being what it is, you just leave it alone, and you wind up with this fabulous vegetation, because even though the mound looked bare, it was full of plants. They were just that big, and they were hiding in the thorny plants. So there was a seed bank living on that mound, and you just protect it, and it's really over time, it just completely filled in. So again, we had great success with the tumulus, and I think you can see in '88 it's almost white or brown from just bare dirt. In '97 it was a little better. In 2002 it was looking pretty good. Now, people also say, well, is that what it used to look like? Well, to be honest, probably not. Because if you were an ancient Phrygian king, like say King Midas, and you wanted your father's tomb to look real good and sharp, and you wanted people to see it from many miles around, you might actually not want grass or plants growing on it. You might like the fact that it's bare, because that white soil would just show up for miles around. So the goal of this is not to reproduce some ancient landscape. I mean, this is a present-day landscape, but we are protecting biodiversity. There are these conservation issues, and we now have a seed source for pasture improvement elsewhere as well, because we are protecting a lot of plants. So moving along to the, yeah. So now, that was the burial mound. So now, with that great success of using plants on the burial mound, I started thinking, well, maybe we could do something inside in the settlement mound. And when I'd been thinking about it, but I didn't really do anything about it because I had no authority to do anything about it. But when Frank Montero, who's a historic preservation guy at Penn, he got involved with the project, and we were talking, and he was telling me about some people that he had worked with in the southwestern U.S., and it was ecologists, and they were trying to regrow grassland or something in the Southwest, and the ecologists, they put out all this wild grass seed, and the next day it was gone. And why was it gone? It was gone because all of the ants had come and harvested all of the seed, and that was the end of that. And they mentioned this to some local, like I think San Ildefonso Pueblo, some local Indian elder, and he said, oh, you know what we used to do? We used to make mud balls, and we would put seeds in mud, and then we'd set out the mud balls, and that would protect them from the insects. Well, I see I get ahead of myself. Part of the management of plants was to get rid of the deep-rooted plants, and every year we cut down the vegetation, and it's a pretty high maintenance operation. So the question is but are plants automatically bad for an exposed archaeological site? Well, my feeling is if you have an open air site like Gordion, that plants are going to grow, and they're going to grow whether you like it or not. And so you can work with nature, or you could work against nature. If you work against nature, you're going to lose. If you work with nature, maybe you'll lose, but maybe you won't. And one of the things that you can see here, this is a little annual grass that just grows on its own. Here you see another grass that just grows on its own. Now, when I was talking to the historic preservation guy, Frank Matero, he had said that in England they put a layer of dirt on wall stubs, archaeological sites, and then they put sod, and that helps protect the walls from rain and snow and ice and so on. So you're not going to get sod in central Anatolia because it's just it's too dry. But there are some plants that might be suitable for that kind of work. And so what we did as an experiment, given the lack of success that I had with the growing perennial grass seeds, we decided to try that mud ball experiment and just to see what would happen. And the experiment was going to be in one of the what we call the terrace buildings of the destruction level that has been exposed for tourists to view for all these years. And so there was this. They put some dirt, and then we did an experiment. We put with this particular grass I know about, a perennial grass that's short, and we planted that. We made mud balls, and the result of it was, as you can see, 2006 is when that experiment began. It was unfortunately a dry year in the winter of 2006, 2007, and 2007, 2008. So we keep trying. But what did happen was the little clumps of grass that we transplanted, they did fine. They survived. They looked dead. I've never seen this particular plant green because I think it's green in February or March when I'm not there. But the fact that it's brown and not gray means it's alive. We put out mud balls and seeds, and they didn't work very well. But then, as we continue, the area of where the sod it's established. It's not great, but it's established. So that was working. And as I say, we keep trying. We collect that particular grass seed, and what they're going to do up here. This is, of course, modern cement. And we're going to try the soft cap approach here too, and some of the cement was going to get ripped up, and we're going to just put the grass seed in and see what happens. So this is a work in progress, but we are trying to use the grasses and the plants to preserve the site, and for the structures, we're going to preferentially weed the deep-rooted plants, and for the slopes, where there's nothing underneath, we can have deep-rooted plants that are pretty, like the nice grasses. So, then. The next part of the program is partly educational, and I don't garden a lot, but I like to garden a little, and I live in an apartment building in Center City, Philadelphia, so I don't get much opportunity. So in the dig house, I started this little demonstration garden with some of these nice grasses. I put little labels up every year, and I try to get the archaeologists interested. It's not easy. But I figure at least, but they just think I'm a nut, but I don't really care. To be perfectly honest, what can I say? So, but I was able to find, it's a long story which there's not time to tell you, but I was able a Turkish botanist, a couple of Turkish botanists actually, and one of them, he works in Gazi University in Ankara, a man named Mecit Viral, and I was able to, when I met him, I said, gee, are there any botanical gardens in Ankara? Because I didn't know of any, and I always like to go to botanical gardens. And to my surprise, he said, no, there aren't. And there ought to be. I think every province in Turkey should have its own botanical garden. And so I said, gee, I was thinking maybe we could have, this is what I want to do at Gordion. And he said, oh, you mean like a mini botanical garden? And I said, yes, a mini botanical garden. So and because I'm only there in June, and a lot of the plants you need to plant them over in the fall or in the winter. So basically, we made arrangements to have, this is the local museum, and we put a little plot right there, and we arranged to have some of the local people come or one of our workers, and they transplanted, they put out mud balls, they had transplanted plants, and so we started it's not a very big plot, but at least it's protected, and so that was the beginning of the mini botanical garden. Then there's Mecit there, the botanist, and then in 2007, we set it up to extend this plot from here to extend it here, and so we have the regular garden, and then we brought in by tractor some gypsum soil, because there are interesting plants that only grow on gypsum soil, so we have the gypsum garden and the regular garden, and it doesn't look like much, but the mud balls, which didn't work so well on the Citadel Mound, the mud bowls worked really well in this area, and so it is a good technology for certain kinds of plants, and we're sort of fine-tuning that. And here you see these are some of the gypsum plants, and then between the two gardens in this spot, I arrived and I almost weeded it out. You know, I hadn't seen him yet, and I wanted to make the garden pretty for him when he showed up. And I thought, you know, I don't know what this plant is, and maybe I'll just leave it here. Well, it turned out it's an endangered species. It used to only grow in one place in Turkey, Gölbaşı Lake. It now grows in two places in Turkey, Gölbaşı Lake and our botanical garden. And at first I thought, oh, gee, you know, like we should only have like local plants here. And I thought, you know, I'm getting so much help from this guy. It's his favorite flower. He loves it. He's helping me out. And why not have also endangered species growing in our garden? It's not like it's going to spread. I mean, so, and that's the plant. And it's really, like, by the time I saw it, it was all brown, but there was one or two flowers so I could take a photograph. Okay, so what's the problem? Everything's moving along. The problem is agricultural development. The government, they put in a major irrigation scheme starting in the mid-90s, and it started working. I mean, it actually started bringing water to the fields about a few years ago. And even though the archaeological monuments, this is one of the smaller mounds, even though officially they're protected by Turkish law because they're archaeological sites, they're not that protected. They may be protected by Turkish law, but they're not protected necessarily by some of the Turkish authorities. And so people, you're not supposed to, it's okay to graze on them, but you're not supposed to farm them, and you're certainly not supposed to irrigate them, and you're certainly not supposed to cut tractor roads on them. And the pace of agricultural development, like I started thinking about the eco-park, what I call the eco-park, you know, about more than 10 years ago, and it's been very slow in getting itself organized. And in the same time when I'm thinking, let's get a move on, folks, agricultural development has really been proceeding apace. And my feeling is, and what I think the archaeology tells us, is that there is a sustainable way to use this landscape. And what we have now that we didn't have in antiquity is tourism, both archaeological tourism and ecological tourism. And it seems to me, I mean, it's my opinion, that we want to protect the viewshed. That was a word that Frank taught me. The viewshed is like what you see, right? And what's this landscape, could you imagine having, like, say, a house there? You know, where you don't want to have buildings in between these mounds. You want to preserve this historical landscape as a very special thing. And if you do that, then you can add to your sustainable agriculture mix, you throw in some tourism, and then you actually are in a position to preserve this landscape for future generations. And my feeling is that you can have a situation where, you know, remember those mounds I showed you? You know, the mounds are gone, you level the mounds, you grow the onions, and then the onions, you overproduce onions, and then you let them, this happens, like I'm not making this up. The onions rot, the water level drops, the springs dry up, there's no water, the mounds just have the usual, this is their leak if you're interested, Paganum harmala. You know, you have all this vegetation that only the animals don't touch, it's the only thing left, right? That you could have that, and the only touch of the Midas touch is, say, a yellow apartment building. So is that the future, or is this where you have the mounds preserved, the water flows, the gardens are green, see that nice mounds, you know, the children play, the eco tourist hikes, you know, and then you have hang gliding off of the cliff. I mean, you know, a lot of biodiversity. Anyway, so that's it. Questions?